Now, I've not said much about William's son, William Campbell, until now, but he married Jane Owler in 1874, so this is around the time of all the chaos. The fire had just happened, his mother was not that long dead, he was 22 years of age, and he must have gone through his teenage years knowing that his mother was seriously ill, and then he had to deal with her death, and that was when he was 19 or 20 years old, and then almost immediately with the loss of the family home and the issues arising from that, and anything coming from his brother's failed apprenticeship. It's interesting that both Williams describe themselves as Carters, pure and simple at this stage. But this marriage, of course, introduces Elizabeth's next set of ancestors, at least the next set that we have to deal with, and that's the Owlers, because by marrying Jane Owler, he is bringing a whole new family into this, and we need to go back and see where they came from. And that's what we'll do in part 2. And this is the Owler family in 1861, when the Campbells were still living up at the house at St Margaret's, just behind Queen Street. At this stage, the Owlers are already living in King Street. Jane Owler, who will marry William Campbell Jr., is only 6 years of age, and she's living with her mum and dad and her brother George. Her dad describes himself at this stage as a labourer, but in a newspaper article describing a court case later that year, he's described as a carter. So it looks as if he got himself set up as a carter sometime in 1861. The other two people here are Jane's granny, Mary Owler, down here, who is George's mum, and Mary's older son, Adam Grewer, who we will find out more about later. 4 years later, in 1865, the Campbells are in King Street as well. And actually, I've had this up in a previous thing. This is the King Street address, and this is the thing that says that William Campbell is a carter and so on. And this is the area that they all lived in. You saw the left-hand map in part 1. This whole area is about 400 metres away from the house in which Elizabeth grew up. All the people that we're talking about were probably in this area by about 1863 or so. The map on the left shows the area just before they all arrived, but I can't imagine it had changed much by the time they did. The one on the right shows it 40 or so years later, so by that time most of the people in this story had died. The graveyard is here and labelled here on this map, and Chapel Lane down there and in the equivalent here. It's a very small area within this set of streets that they were in. You can see the same thing here in this second map. When William and Jane marry, they move away, all the way to Dundas Street here. But that comes later. When the Campbells arrive, I think they live here, which is in King Street, and they have stables, as I said in the other thing, around that area too. The Owlers are in King Street already, and they must be very close neighbours because there are very few buildings. They might even be living both in this building here. Both William Campbell and George Owler are carters. William is about 50 years old and a bit more experienced. John is half his age and new to the whole thing. This family tree shows all the main actors in this. The oldest that I'll say much about is Mary Henderson, who came from the Blairgowrie area and landed in Broughty Ferry sometime in the mid-1800s. She then had a son, George, who came with her when she made that change, and he eventually would marry Janet Elder, who the two of them then would have Jane Owler here. Jane, of course, married the younger William Campbell, and from the two of them came Elizabeth's granny. But up here are two people that we've seen before in part one, William Campbell Sr. and his wife Elizabeth Taylor, who of course died tragically just before, or just a year or so before their house was destroyed. So we know how the Campbells got to this point. What about the Owlers? Well, Jane's granny, Mary Owler, Mary Henderson, that I pointed out on the family tree in the last slide, was living with the family in 1861. And so we're going to start the Owler story with her. And as I said, she was born in Blairgowrie. We know quite precisely where and when Mary was born because it's set out in a bit more detail than usual in the church records. She was christened in 1797 and the family address was given as Peggyfield near Chapelton of St Finch, Buchney, Perthshire. And this is her entry here, saying that she's the lawful daughter of John Henderson and Elizabeth Cameron, who was actually John's second wife. And I think from memory, Mary was the first child of that second marriage. I thought it was worth showing the whole page just to show how messy these things can be, and this is a relatively good one. There's quite a bit of information in comparison to some. So we went to find Peggyfield not more than a week or two ago, and perhaps we took a couple of pictures. I should probably have included one of them here. But this is Peggyfield here, that dot there, and it's near Rattray, which is beside Blairgowrie. Dundee down here, Perth over here, and up here the Blairgowrie kind of area. And there's a wee bit of a coincidence with all this, because when Elizabeth and I were students, we had a holiday job one summer in a castle near Blairgowrie that was called Craighall, and it was the seat of the Rattray family. At that time, money was hemorrhaging out of that family. They were selling farms just to stay afloat. But in 1797, the Rattray family owned a lot of land, including Peggyfield, where Mary was born. Mary's father would have paid rent to the Rattray family, as this shows. 170 years later, Mary's great-great-great-granddaughter was employed by the heir to the Rattrays, shown here, and that employer was called Captain Rattray, and it was under his rather pathetic stewardship that they sold the last few farms and eventually lost the family home. But this is the entry for Peggyfield for the OS maps. I think it's about 1850 or something like that, and it gives a description here and says here Rattray of Craighall. So I'm assuming that 50 years earlier, when Mary was born, the Rattrays would have been the owners. Now, Mary was born around the time when Blairgowrie was just beginning to use water power from the River Ericht, which flows through Blairgowrie, to run the machinery to make cloth. In 1878, somebody built a mill there called the Meikle Mill, and this was the first purpose-built spinning mill using modern machinery. But surprisingly, no more mill building took place on the Ericht until 1830. By this time, Mary was 35 or so, and I think long gone. In September 1819, she had had a child by a farmer called Adam Gruer, who worked on a farm, or rented a farm, I think, called Loughlands, which was about 2 miles south of Peggyfield. This child, Adam, was not christened until November. His father, Adam Gruer, did admit to being the father, but Adam and Mary never married. In fact, I don't think that Adam ever married at all. He fathered another child with a different woman in 1826. Just after this second child was born, when Adam would have been 7 years old or so, Mary married a ploughman called David George Owler, and the marriage took place just on the other side of Alyth in a village called Ruthven. This is the record from the church register. There is a slight doubt about this, since the groom's name is written as Wooler, W-O-O-L-E-R. But there can't have been many Mary Hendersons from Rattray, and it's very easy to imagine Owler becoming Wooler when those involved may well have been illiterate and certainly not able to write themselves. So I feel sure that this is correct. I included the record before theirs to show that other marriages in Ruthven parish were contracted a week before they took place. This one was the 11th and the marriage took place on the 18th, and that's typical that it would be. I look back on all the others and they seem to be that was the standard gap between the contraction of the marriage and the actual marriage taking place. But Mary's, as you can see here, was only one day, December the 16th to December the 17th. After this marriage, I lose Mary completely for 10 years. Later census information and death certificates and so on seem to say that she had a child in the mid-1830s. He is mostly called George Owler. But in the 1851 census, Mary's 17-year-old son, i.e. one that was born in the mid-30s, is called George Butter. I suppose this actually supports the idea that the father in the last thing was Wooler 1 minute and Owler the next. Now we've got a George Butter 1 minute who becomes George Owler the next. I hardly think that Mary had two different sons of about the same age, both called George, one of whom disappeared in 1851 and reappeared in 1861 when the other one disappeared. A variety of places are given as George's birthplace, including Lundy and Fowlis Webster, and there's problems with that I don't even want to go into. I can find no record of his birth anywhere in Scotland. I did mention earlier that the Owlers didn't go in much for record keeping. This is all a bit of a mess. If it wasn't for all the crimes that George committed, it would have been difficult to follow them. But the crime stories have helped a lot. We need to get back to Mary. I have an 1841 census for a Mary Owler working as a mill worker in Blairgowrie, but it turns out that Mary is a transcription error and that the true name is Margaret. Margaret Owler was George's sister-in-law. She had married his brother, whose name I think was James. This 1851 census has Mary in Broughty Ferry at the age of 54. She is living with a son called Adam Grewer, who now has a daughter living with him down here, Catherine. Then there is this George Butter, who seems to be George Owler. He is 17 and was supposedly born in 1834 in Lundy or Fowlis Webster, as I said. And as I also said, by 1861, George Butter has gone and George Owler has taken his place. And he was born in Fowlis Easter, I think I'm right in saying. And that's a mess too, because Fowlis Easter is not in Perthshire, I don't think. It's in Angus. Anyway, it's near Lundy. So I suspect that George Butter is a transcription error, and unfortunately, because I can find no birth records anywhere near Lundy for a George Butter or a George Owler or even a George Henderson, I've just got to take this as evidence that he was born somewhere. Mary turns up then in Broughty Ferry sometime before 1851 with her two sons. By 1861, the younger one, George, has married Janet, and she's become Janet Owler. And they have two children. And they are also living with Mary. Mary's husband, George, is in the ferry too at this point, but is not living with them. So there's a lot that we do not know about Mary. And the final part of that is that in 1861, in her entry for this 1861 census, she says she's living on a pension, and I have not been able to find out where that pension could have come from or what it could possibly be. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I'd love to know. Now, from the time when Mary Henderson turns up in this census in 1861, we can move from following, or trying to follow her, to following her son George. And from now on, George Owler and William Campbell, the two Carters, feature prominently in newspaper reports about court proceedings. In 1861, Jane's father, George, is severely injured as a result of an assault, and the following year he is found guilty of fighting and spends 5 days in prison. At least I assume he did that rather than pay the 5-shilling fine. I don't think I know for definite. The assault that he suffered is described in this article over here. Now, although I've dealt with the Campbells elsewhere, I'm just going to say a little bit more about them here to try and keep George and William going along together. And we've already seen that by 1865 the Campbells had moved into King Street, and that William was renting a stable and some ground there, and they were living in a house which he also rented. It's around this time that Elizabeth Campbell must be struggling a bit with the effects of the breast cancer. in May 1867, George admits, this is George Owler of course, to being involved in a fight and succeeds in getting treated leniently. He does this by bringing to the court's attention the fact that he has an aging mother, and that, of course, is Mary Henderson. In 1868, some things are stolen from William Campbell's stable, and he goes around slandering, accusing another man of having been involved with this, and ends up in court found guilty of slander. Then in 1869, George's son, George Jr., is mentioned for the first time, and he seems to be getting into the family tradition early. He is 13, and he seems to have been harassing or bullying another boy, or I had a feeling it was maybe a girl. Anyway, the child's mother takes matters into her own hands, and she ends up in court charged with assaulting the 13-year-old George. I had to separate the two parts of that story, but I think they're clear enough. And the following year, William Campbell is back in jail. He is accused of hitting a neighbour called Margaret Dixon with a brush. I described this already in part 1. He pleads not guilty but is found guilty and is given a 30-day sentence. It is now 1870 and George's daughter Jane is 15 or so. Perhaps the next decade will bring better times. But it doesn't start well. By 1872, George Orwell Sr. is now well into his 30s, and his son George may be 17 or 18. So this breach of the peace, reported in Chapel Lane, could be either of them. Much more seriously, and as we already know, 1872 was disastrous for the Campbells. It seems that in March, young William's mother died of breast cancer, and then that autumn, their house in Chapel Lane was destroyed by fire. In March 1876, William Jr. is in court. Now, this is unusual. I think it's his only appearance in court. And later on, I think I have the thing that I'll put into this, where he is described as a very steady young man. But he wasn't steady on this occasion. It's interesting also that in the article he's described as a mason, because as we've seen, his brother was an apprentice mason for a while. It looks as if the family saw the profession of stonemason as a good route, but never quite made it into that job. William certainly went back to being a carter. He didn't stay as a mason. It's also interesting that he was charged with assaulting George Owler. So this is Jane's new husband accused of assaulting her brother. This may be the case in which one of the witnesses was later assaulted by William Campbell. I assume that this witness gave evidence against William Jr. By the late 70s, William seems to be less involved in all this court appearance carry-on. But the Owlers are still often in trouble, and in the autumn of 1878, father and son are charged after a disturbance. I wonder if they were beginning to feel a lot of pressure. Certainly by this time, George Owler seems to have major financial troubles, and in November 1882, there is a warrant sale which sells his horse and other things to pay off creditors. The advert for the sale I found in one newspaper here but also this rather, is it a tongue-in-cheek kind of article perhaps, here about the whole case, because it seems to have troubled the sheriff a bit whether he could really find anybody guilty for what went on. Because what seems to have happened is that George seems to have secreted away some of the stuff that was supposed to be part of the warrant sale. Now, I've included this article about government works in Broughty Castle because I think it's just possible that this is our William Campbell, but he's described as John William Campbell, so I doubt it. But it gives another bit of an insight into the kind of stuff that the Carters got up to, and so it's worth having a look at, even if it's not him. And if it is him, I think it's interesting because by this time, well, certainly this William Campbell does not own his own horse. He doesn't own his own cart. And I suspect that by this date, our William Campbell didn't either. In 1890, Jane's father, George Sr., dies suddenly, overnight, closely followed in 1992 by Jane's husband, William, who gets blood poisoning after his leg gets crushed by a large stone that he was unloading. William Sr. dies sometime in the 1890s, although I've not been able to establish exactly when, and Jane's mother dies in 1898. So the family is decimated by this time. This is the bit about him being a steady man. But worse was to come. In 1899, Jane herself dies. Of course, by 1899, the older children in the family are already independent, but the younger ones are not. The youngest of all had only been born in 1889, just 2 years before her father's death, and now, at 10 years old, this girl has lost her mother as well. This girl is Elizabeth's granny, the person really that we've been basing this whole thing on. And her name, of course, is Mary Campbell. Well, actually, her full name is Mary Jane Elder Campbell. The Jane is after her mum, and the Elder, well, because that was her granny's maiden name. It makes the death of these two women by the time Jane was 10 all the more sad. Jane was taken in by her married sister, who had married Thomas Nichol and lived in Brown Street, really far away, just one street along from Dundas Street, where she had lived with her parents. So this is Thomas Nichol here, and Helen. Helen is Mary's sister. And so you can imagine that with 3 children of these ages, 3 boys, it maybe quite suited Helen to take Mary Campbell in for a while, but it wasn't long before she left. Just 6 years, in fact. This is her marrying Elizabeth's granddad, Don. 3 years later, the couple were in America, but that's another story. To finish this story, I need to go back to Jane Kerr. Everybody else here has been dealt with. Jane Owler being George's daughter and him being married to Janet Elder and Mary Henderson. We didn't say much about him because the two of them seemed to live very separate lives, although they were brought both in the ferry. And we didn't say much about him because he was away at sea all the time. But we should have said, or I need to say, a bit more about Jane Elder. Because of all the people in the top line here, Jane is the only one who was actually born in Broughty Ferry. All the three of them had been born outside, round about maybe Alyth or Maniki or somewhere like that, and then had travelled in. But she was born in Broughty Ferry. She had been brought by her mother, actually. So that's the other thing that makes Jane stand out. She is Elizabeth's mother's 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 mother. If we go back further in this line of mothers, we get a list that looks like this. You've got Margaret Dawn, Elizabeth's mother, Mary Jane Elder, her granny who went to America and lost her parents young and all that stuff, Jane Owler, who got married to George Owler, who kept being in the papers for assaults and so on, Jane Elder, her mother, then back to Jane Kerr, Angus Hay, Margaret Kerr, Margaret Maxwell. There are two Kerrs here, but that's just coincidence. There's no relationship between these two. And of course, because they're women, there's no one name going through the whole thing. Every generation is a different name. Jane Kerr's mother, Agnes Hay, seems to be the one who left a country area, Maniki, and ended up in Broughty Ferry. She had 3 children to David Kerr, whom she married in 1799. The first, William Kerr, was born in Maniki, like his mother. The second was born almost exactly 2 years later in Dundee. The third is Elizabeth's great-great-great-granny, Jane Kerr, and she was born in Broughty Ferry. She married George Elder and became Jane Elder. According to Jane's death certificate, her father, David Kerr, was a Royal Marine. Agnes must have married David at 23, had children at 25, 27 and 30, and then no more. This seems a wee bit unusual. I can't find when either she or David died, but I suspect that he might have died during the Napoleonic Wars. Certainly he's likely to have become a Royal Marine because of the recruitment campaign that was launched when Britain was trying to defeat Napoleon, and he must have served through a very dangerous time. Although there is no direct record of Jane Kerr's birth, parts of her life can be followed through the 1841 and 1851 censuses, when she would have been 35 and 45 years of age, respectively. George Elder never appears on the census returns, and I assume he is away at sea. In 1841, Jane Kerr is listed as living with 4 children. The eldest is 15, the youngest is 7. In 1851, William and Agnes have left, but Jane still has her 2 youngest daughters, both of whom are in their very late teens and are weavers. The 3 of them live together in West Ferry. 3 years or so later, in 1854, the elder of these 2 daughters, Janet Elder, left and married George Owler, and according to the 1861 census, moved in with his mum. But by 1861, Jane Kerr had been dead for 5 years, and George was about to follow. Jane died at an address in Claypots Road. George died in Constable Street, close to the harbour, not surprisingly, I suppose.